Is New York City about to take the most important step they've taken in the last decade towards building more housing? Alec Schierenbeck is here to help us figure it out. Alec is the executive director of the New York City Charter Revision Commission. And what that means is that he's helping the commission that is advising New York City on how to change its city charter to make it easier to build more housing. We're going to talk about why we're changing the city charter in this city in the first place, what steps would actually make it easier to build more housing, who might be opposed to this, and ultimately what the impact might be. As always, thank you for listening to the podcast. If you want to tell a friend about it, share it on social media, gossip about it with your work colleagues, all of that is appreciated. If you really want to support the podcast, you can do so by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism at cnliberalism.org/become a member. Members get access to bonus episodes. They organize in their local communities. It's great. You should give it a try. Thank you for listening and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me today is Alec Schierenbeck. Alec, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so New York City is considering revising its city charter. And we're doing this for a number of reasons, but can you tell us the quick story of, number one, why does this matter? Obviously New York is the biggest city in the country. It matters for people here. But what's going on with the city charter? What is the city charter? And why ultimately are we revising it? How did we get here?
Sure. Well, the city charter, it's basically the city's constitution. It defines the elected officials we have, and it defines the process through which we make decisions. And one of the processes it sets out is how we make land use decisions, how we decide what gets built where. And New York City has an affordability crisis. Experts also know that the cause of our housing crisis is fundamentally a shortage of housing. We need to build more. And the process through which we allow more to get built, that's set out in the charter. It's called the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure, or ULURP. And the last time we took a hard look at it in New York City was 36 years ago. And so in a very different New York that was facing very different challenges. And so we think now, with a housing affordability crisis at its apex, we need to take a look at whether we can simplify and speed up the process so that ultimately we can deliver more housing.
That's an acronym that you should all get used to, by the way, ULURP. It is something that very few people outside of New York have ever heard of. Frankly, very few people inside New York have heard of. Most people don't really need to know what it is in their day-to-day life. But ULURP defines so much about the city. So I think it's worth diving into a little bit, because we're going to be talking about it so much, exactly what ULURP is, you said it's the land use, review policy, basically. But in practice, what does that mean? What does ULURP do? And how is ULURP, kind of used to make decisions? And what effect does it have on the city?
Sure. Well, ULURP defines how the city makes land use decisions. And that can mean changing the zoning to allow more housing on a lot. It could mean creating a new park. It could mean allowing a new sanitation facility. It can mean when the city government sells land to a affordable housing developer to build affordable housing. All of these decisions are today channeled through one process, and it's a one-size-fits-all process. It doesn't distinguish between big things and small things. And that process goes like this. First, you have a community board weigh in. Then you have a borough president weigh in. Those opinions are advisory, but very important in practice for how an application turns out. Then you have the City Planning Commission, which is a body with appointments by the mayor and each of the borough presidents, which we have here in New York City, and the public advocate, another citywide elected official. After that, it's the city council. And after that, there's a mayoral veto and a potential city council override of that veto. But what this turns into is a process where fundamentally the most important decision happens at the city council level. And under a practice that isn't in the charter, but that has been developed by the city council, the fundamental decision for a land use application is made by the local council member who represents that district under a practice called member deference, which is very common in other cities where legislative bodies have land use decision making and legislators are elected at the district level.
I know that, like in Chicago, I think they call it like aldermanic privilege or something like that because they have aldermen instead of councilors.
Exactly right. This is just a tendency of legislative bodies with districted officials that have land use authority. They tend to defer to the member who represents an area.
And so in practice, ULURP is this one-size-fits-all process. Everything has to be run through, whether it's, somebody wants to tear down a 3-story building and build a 6-story building, or if they want to build a super tall skyscraper that's, 55 stories tall. Fundamentally, it goes through the same process. It has the same number of checks and balances, community board hearings, potentially, and the same number of veto points, and the borough president and the city council and community boards and the mayor, and the same type of environmental review, and like it's all the same no matter what.
That's basically right. What we heard at the commission, and we held hearings all across the city and talked to New Yorkers and housing experts, is that with 50 years of experience with ULURP, it was created in 1975, we've learned that there are some problems. It actually does a pretty good job of synthesizing local feedback and borough feedback and expert feedback and the views of democratically accountable elected officials for big things and in most places. But it has at least 3 significant weaknesses that the charter proposals on New Yorkers' ballots this November are attempting to address. One is that it imposes really significant hurdles on publicly financed affordable housing. We've made it very difficult to do publicly financed affordable housing with public dollars. We've made it more difficult for that to happen than for privately financed all market rate construction. The second is that ULURP is fundamentally broken for small changes. Because the process is one size fits all, and it has the same cost and length and risk for someone who wants to build a 3-story apartment building with 6 units as someone who wants to build the Burj Khalifa, people just don't even start the process to ask for small changes because it doesn't make any sense. And then third, and this is really important, it's just broken in whole parts of the city where there is no housing production today, and particularly no affordable housing production, because the practice of deferring entirely to the local member on questions of land use has meant that anywhere in the city where it's too politically toxic to say yes to housing, no housing gets built. In fact, people don't even propose to build housing there because they know the proposals are dead on arrival. And I've talked to council members about particular projects working in city government on housing. And I've had conversations where council members say, I'd love to say yes to this project. I know it's a good thing, but I can't. I just can't politically. And when they say that to me, they're not lying. They're telling the truth. There are good people in all of these jobs, but structurally, we've set the system up to fail if what we want is more housing.
So I guess the next logical question then is, we've got this process, ULURP, that seems to be, it's a fairly long, involved process. It certainly takes a while to work through. And maybe that's appropriate for like the biggest of the bigs. If we're building Hudson Yards, if you called it the Burj Khalifa, if we're building something massive, maybe we want a long process. But most people don't live in super talls in New York. Most people live in buildings of 2 to 5 stories. That's the vast majority of Queens. That's the vast majority of Brooklyn. And frankly, it's a lot of neighborhoods in Manhattan too. Everybody thinks of Manhattan as, you know, universally skyscrapers, but that's not most of it. There's a lot of Manhattan that is just four-story buildings as far as the eye can see. And to say nothing of the Bronx or Staten Island or whatever. And so we've made it really difficult for this to happen. You also mentioned that it's really difficult for certain types of affordable housing to be built, for publicly financed affordable housing, and that certain neighborhoods are just no-go zones, essentially. And then the question becomes, well, what are we going to do about it? And how does revising the city charter help?
That's right. And there are a lot of different aspects of what the commission is proposing and what voters will pass on. But in short, we're trying to create simpler, faster, and less political process for targeted categories of housing. In particular, projects that are going to deliver affordable housing and modest projects. Um, so, part of what we're doing is creating a simplified process for modest changes. Um, what does that mean? Um, well, we did a analysis of everything that went through ULURP in the last 10 years. And we found that there wasn't a single request to add housing that represented a bump of less than 30%. Okay, 30% or less. In other words, nobody came through ULURP asking, I can do 10 stories now, but could I do 13 tomorrow? Because it just doesn't make any economic sense to go through that process. So one idea we have that voters can vote on is whether to create a simpler, faster process for that kind of small bump, 30% or less. That way we can get a little bit more. And we think that's a great idea because there's something a little perverse about a public process that categorically prevents people from asking for the kind of incremental and organic changes that communities say they most want to see, and forces into the public review process only the kind of big leaps that folks find it hardest to grapple with. So that's one change. Another change is in that same category, is to allow people who want to build something no taller than a standard height of 45 feet to go through the same process. So if you want to build a really modest multifamily building, maybe, 4 stories, 3 units, you'd also be able to go through this shorter process. And that's a kind of application we also don't see today. And Jeremiah, that's really important because when New York City built more housing, and we used to build a lot more housing. In the 1920s, just that one decade, we built more housing than was built between 1970 and 2020 in New York City. When we built more housing, what we built was modest multifamily housing. In particular, the 6-story apartment building, which continues to be all over the city and be like a bastion of affordability and homeownership, and really defines so many New York City neighborhoods.
Yep, I live on the 6th story right now, and I used to live on the 4th story of a 4-story building, and I used to live on the 5th story of a 5-story building, and yeah, not a lot of fun walking up to the 5th floor of a walk up, but like that's the majority of New York, and especially once you get into the boroughs, it's all 2 to 3 stories, like and that line about like there are 0 requests for small changes for like, I want to go 9 stories to 12 stories or whatever. Like the fact that happens 0% of the time is just tragic, because that is that like I'm trying to like even come up with an analogy of how stupid this is. Like, what if we only allowed car companies to build cars that were Hummers, and like small cars were illegal or so? Like, I don't know. The analogies aren't coming, but like it's a crazy thing.
Totally. No, totally. We only sell party size subs here. But no, that's right. And I think that also leads to a lot of dissatisfaction in communities where they're saying, why is it the only requests we see for housing is stuff that feels out of scale? And look, we need big stuff too. Let's not get it crooked. To solve the housing crisis, we need high density and medium density and low density development. But we're in particular not getting that low density and modest stuff now. And so we think it's straightforward to create a process that could maybe unlock more.
And the process right now is what's stopping it. That just it essentially makes no economic sense to make a small ask when the process is going to take you years and probably cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars in whether it's lost time, wages, effort. Like it's an expensive, involved process to go through this, and it's just not worth it for anything that's small. So we need to make a process that small projects can actually economically survive, basically.
That's totally right. I mean, to expand on that idea, the more complicated we make process, the more likely it is that the only people who can take advantage of it are big firms that are trying to make a lot of money and can afford to hire the lobbyists and lawyers and consultants that are needed to navigate an extraordinarily opaque insider's political process. And if you simplify process, then suddenly smaller builders, MWBEs, and the kind of mom and pop builders that used to do a lot of production in the city, they actually might be able to navigate this process without hiring consultants and lobbyists to get through public review. And that could unlock a whole new uh, industry of smaller builders that can deliver modest housing.
There's another aspect to this that when I talk to real estate people, one of the things they mention is not just the cost in dollar terms or even in time, because those are both really important. It's really important that whether the process takes 3 months or whether it takes 2 years. It's enormously important, obviously. And the dollar costs in terms of whatever fees and salaries and all the accumulated costs to hire contractors and lawyers and whatever else. All of that is super, super important. But they also mentioned to me the risk from uncertainty, the fact that they can go through this ULURP process and they're trying to do something good. They want to build more housing, but they might spend all this time and this money and this effort and it just gets rejected. It just, somebody along the way, whether it's a community board person or the council member or somebody gets a bee in their bonnet and gets really mad and decides this is not going to stand, and the effort all just goes down the drain. And it seems like that's what they really just can't abide, is that level of uncertainty. So when we're talking about a new process that we might be creating under the city charter, how is that going to be addressed? The kind of inherent uncertainty of I could go through this whole thing and it might just get rejected. Like even if it's fast, that's that's still kind of an issue, right?
It totally is. But we're not eliminating the risk that there'll be a no. Actually, what's important here is that this is just a process for asking. So there are no guarantees. And, the City Planning Commission is going to be the body that ultimately passes on someone asking for a modest change. And it will be the case that they will find that some of these requests are inappropriate for really sound planning reasons. And so a lot of people are going to get a no. That's okay. Um, but what this does do is reduce the risk by creating a process that is less political and that is out in the light. Because right now, fundamentally, if you only have one person who is giving a decisive vote on whether a project moves forward, it's an extremely backroom process, I should say. And it is really inscrutable to the public and even to the people on the other side. There is nothing more hectic than the 24 hours before a land use vote at the city council, where all the deal making is happening. and the public and even other council members have no idea what's going on in that room. Um, and so we think that by moving some of these decisions out into the light, by bringing more voices to the table and having it fundamentally be a planning decision rather than a question of individual political calculus, that you can bring some predictability.
Well, let's talk about what these actually do, because we have, I think there's 6 questions for voters to answer on the ballot in November in New York City, and not all of them relate to housing. But I think specifically questions 2 through 5 are basically revisions to the city charter that we believe could make it easier to build more housing. So, can we run through real quick what those are actually going to do in terms of what will they change? What is question number 2, question number 3, et cetera?
Okay, yeah, let's try to do it quick. Okay, so New Yorkers are going to get their ballots. They're going to flip their ballots and they're going to see 6 questions. The first question actually has nothing to do with New York City. It's a state constitutional amendment that has to do with a Olympic facility in the Adirondacks. Okay, so we're not talking about that much anymore, but you should look it up. Go to the League of Women Voters and get some information about that. Question 2 is where the city charter amendments start, and that question creates 2 fast tracks for affordable projects. The first fast track is for publicly financed affordable housing. That's when the government itself is bankrolling, typically 100% affordable housing, deeply affordable housing. And that creates a process at what's called the Board of Standards and Appeals, which is an apolitical expert body where the members are appointed by the mayor, but approved by the city council. And they will be able to grant zoning relief to publicly financed affordable housing projects so that when the city itself is bankrolling deeply affordable housing, we're spending more money on housing and less money on process. That question also creates a fast track in the 12 community districts in New York City. We have 59 community districts. In the 12 community districts that build the least affordable housing. So every 5 years, we're going to look at the whole city and we're going to see which parts of town are building the least amount of affordable housing. And in those districts, there will be a fast track where it will be the city planning commission rather than the city council at the end. And the core insight there is that if we want every part of the city to do its share for projects that deliver affordable housing, then we need to break out of the political logjam in those extreme outlier districts where today virtually no affordable housing is being built. And when I say virtually no, I mean it. Today, the bottom 10 council districts average just 3 affordable units a year, 3, compared to the top 10 that average over 750 units a year. So that's quite a disparity. That's question 2. Question 3 creates that modest process for modest projects we talked about. Again, it's faster review, cuts the public review time basically in half, keeps community boards in their role. Borough presidents still have an advisory opinion, but it's going to end at the City Planning Commission, which is 13 people. 12 of those are approved with the advice and consent of the city council, and their appointments by the mayor, each borough president, the public advocate. And the projects that are eligible for that are the small ones we talked about earlier, getting a 30% or less bump, building something that's 45 feet tall. We're also allowing for certain climate and resiliency projects to go through that fast track, because if there's something as pressing as the housing crisis for New York City, it's the climate emergency, and we need to do a lot of things to treat it like an emergency.
So, just to say for 1 second on question 3, that almost sounds like it's designed to kind of bypass the problem of member deference. That board, that ultimately the final decision might be with the mayor and the public advocate and so on. Who is the third member there?
Oh, okay. So the City Planning Commission, it is the end of question 3. And on the City Planning Commission are 13 people.
Gotcha.
7 of the members are appointed by the mayor. 5 are appointed by the borough presidents, and 1 is appointed by the public advocate.
Okay, gotcha.
And 12 of those 13 people are appointed with the advice and consent of the city council, which means, the mayor gets to suggest people, but ultimately, if the city council wants to reject them and says no dice, then, the mayor would have to appoint someone else. And so we think that kind of provides a check and a balance. It's not cutting the council out, but it's changing the nature of their role to having a decision on the independent board, on who's on the independent board rather than having a direct decision on those projects.
Yeah, so I guess I'm kind of, because I'm fascinated by this, practice of member deference, which is one of the big reasons nothing gets built. Because, like you said, there's intense pressure for nobody to really allow anything in their district. They're all fine with something in somebody else's district, but in the pure NIMBY, literally just not in my backyard sense. And the question two kind of tries to bypass that by the 12 worst performing districts are going to just go through a different process. They're going to have a different level of approval, and this one also seems to be just bypassing. We're trying to get out of that mode of just the member can always say no.
Yeah, it's trying to accomplish a few things. It's let's make it faster, let's make it simpler, and for these categories of projects, let's try to make it less political, or at least have the political decision making not turn entirely on the individual political calculus of a member looking just narrowly at the impact on something on their district. And look, this is the teaching you see all over the country of places that are doing a better job of building versus places that are doing a less good job. Um, a lot of the downsides of construction and development are hyperlocal, whether it's like noise, parking, but the upsides tend to be a little bit more diffuse, right? The need to add housing that addresses rising costs across a housing market, that's a little bit more diffuse. And so when you make the decision totally based on the immediate neighbors, you're more likely to get to a no than if you make a decision that's balancing those views against, citywide interests.
And so then we've got questions 4 and 5, the last two that really concern housing.
That's right. Question 4 is in some ways the most direct response to this member deference dynamic. It says, for affordable housing projects, for projects that are required to deliver affordable housing, instead of the city council having the last say, there's going to be a new thing called the Affordable Housing Appeals Board. And on it are the mayor, the speaker, and the borough president of that borough. And if 2 out of those 3 people agree, they can flip a project that is rejected by the council or restore a project that's cut down. And the basic idea is this is a way to give another lease on life to projects that otherwise can't survive the political gauntlet, and to maybe strike a better balance between like local, borough, and citywide views on affordable housing projects.
That one's interesting because, again, this problem of bypassing member deference, it comes up again. There's kind of a new potential final decider, but it's interesting in that it still gives the city council member a kind of ability to vote, and they can almost do there's a thing in Congress called, like, vote no, pray yes, where individual members know that there's like some must pass piece of legislation, but there's something that like an activist is mad about, and so they're kind of being pressured to vote no, and so they vote no, hoping that someone else will take the hard vote and vote yes, so they can remain pure, but really they're glad that it passed. And so, like, it's like these city council members could still potentially vote against an affordable housing project in their district. And then, oh, well, I tried, but it went to the mayor. And oh, God, that mayor, he did it again. He built the housing, like I can see that dynamic kind of playing out where secretly they're relieved that there's actually affordable housing getting built.
It's definitely possible. What I'll say is right now, these members are under intense pressure. We had a member testify at the commission, I should say a former member, because they got death threats when they were potentially going to support a project. Their home was burglarized. The police had them install a panic button in their home because of threats to them and to their staff.
Wow.
And that's the kind of pressure that a council member can be under, because now everybody knows, even a small number of voices in a district that are really angry about a project, that all they need to do is convince the local member to say no, and then the project is almost certain to be dead. And at a human level, that is not a good situation to be in if you're a council member. And, I think that the Affordable Housing Appeals Board can kind of relieve some of that pressure and create a healthier dynamic because right now it's very easy to say no and uh, to have a project go away. But if there's an Affordable Housing Appeals Board, a member might know that their decision to say no isn't necessarily the end of the matter. And so that might actually give them an incentive to get to yes.
Man, having your home burglarized is crazy. That's New York. I mean, it is New York. I don't know if that's just. I don't know if any other cities have that particular issue, but that's almost all of them. There's one left. There's question number 5. So what does question number 5 do?
This is a little wonky, but the city map is the official record of where the streets of the city are and parks and so on. And it plays a very important role in the development process as you have a new address assigned or you have to reflect your development on the city map. But the crazy thing is that today the city map is actually 5 different sets of paper maps administered in borough offices. It's over 8,000 individual paper maps. And some of these are old, fragile maps that are handled with gloves. This system is rooted generously in the 20th century. And we want to update that by creating a single digital map. New York became a city with 5 boroughs in 1898, and maybe we should have created one map then, but we're getting around to it in 2025.
I think we should emphasize because it's crazy to me that like this is how the city operates, but more than 8,000 paper maps are what govern New York City. And like when something changes, when you build, you knock down 2 or 3 buildings and you build one big building in their stead, you have to physically go to like several sets of paper maps and update them rather than like any of this being computerized. Like the current state of it is literally just they're in some dank basement somewhere and there's like a guy who has to physically redraw a physical paper map in 2025.
Basically, yes. And look, this is because this process was written into the city charter, and it's a 1960s system, and that's why we need to update it through the charter. A lot of people have reached out and said, "Why the hell are we voting on this? Shouldn't you just do this without a vote?" And we've said we'd love it if you could, but you need to vote yes if you want that to happen.
So we think that these changes will allow more housing to be built. To me, it certainly seems like that, and I'm sure that was the commission's logic in endorsing some of these changes or in recommending some of these changes. Their logic was, look, we think we can speed up housing development by making some of these changes. We're going to get more housing built because of this. I'm curious though, when we say speed up the process, like what part of the process are we actually speeding up? Are we eliminating certain things? Are we shortening timelines? Are we getting rid of certain requirements? What does shortening the process for whether it's affordable housing or modest housing or just housing in the 12 worst performing districts or things like that, what does it actually mean to create a quicker process?
We're shortening stages. We are combining stages. We are eliminating stages, all of which are aimed at creating simpler, faster, less political process. So, I'll just give an example. On the fast track in the bottom 12 community districts, today, you have a community board go for 60 days, then a borough president go for 30 days, then a city planning commission go, and then a city council go, and then a mayor override, and then a potential council override of that veto. And we're shortening that. We're taking the community board and borough president, we're combining their periods of review. So we're not shortening the community board's time, but by combining the borough president into it, we save time. And then we go straight to the city planning commission, and that's it. And so for that, for example, we're taking the public review period and cutting it in half. But I'll give you another example for publicly financed affordable housing. That actually allows us to potentially approve affordable projects faster than today you can even enter public review, because we're going to be giving project specific relief to affordable housing projects, which is something you can't do today under ULURP. That means we're giving zoning relief just to that building that wants to be 100% affordable. And as a result, we can really simplify the environmental review that is attendant to that kind of project. And by doing that, we can actually save applicants maybe six figures and a lot more time before they can put a shovel in the ground.
And what kind of timeline savings do you think we're talking about here? Like, what does a typical project take right now? And what do you think a typical project just obviously this is ballpark, but what do you think it would take under the new speedy process?
Well, just for the public review uh, process that is in the charter, we're taking a process that is, basically 7 to 8 months and cutting it in half. But as I mentioned, by changing the nature of the public review, you can actually change what happens before that gets started, where you're getting your materials ready. Part of what takes so long is that when you have a really complicated political process to navigate, you have to spend a lot of time doing politics even before you fire the starting gun. And by simplifying the process, by making it less political, we can actually just see projects kick off earlier because they're not going to have to spend as much time doing prep work with lobbyists and lawyers.
I do have one complaint about this entire new process, and that is the naming of it, because we have ULURP, which is Unified Land Use Review Policy or something like that. And I really would love if you had called the new one the Speedy Land Use Review Policy so that it could just be SLURP. And it really bugs me that you just missed that opportunity. We could slurp up some new housing is what I'm saying.
We thought about Slurp. We thought about Slurp. We really seriously thought about Slurp. We thought about Flurp faster. We thought about JLurp Junior. But ELurp just sounded like it rolled off the tongue a little bit, and that it wasn't so silly we couldn't say it with a straight face.
ELURP sounds like a background Star Wars character to me, but I guess that's good too. I don't know.
Yeah, ELurp saw whether Han shot first, yeah, for sure.
Oh man. Okay, we're way off track now, but you know what? This is my show. We're allowed to go as far off track as we want. So one of the interesting things here is that this commission was empowered by the city council, and this commission was not created with like in opposition to the city council or anything like that. But the city council now finds itself opposing many of these housing regulations. And the cynic in me says that they are just power hungry and don't want to, lose their member deference or their veto power. But what can you tell us about like how the commission was actually created? Because it's curious to me that like at every housing group in the city, basically every good governance and housing group in the city is telling people to vote yes. And the city council by itself is just telling people to vote no.
Look, we had a great group of people on this commission. People like our chair, Richard Beery, who's the head of the anti-poverty organization Robin Hood, and was the deputy mayor who, under de Blasio, helped launch Pre-K for All. We have people who were homelessness activists. We have people who've been building affordable housing. We have people who run the United Way and the YMCA of New York. So this was like a real cross section of civil society, people who understand government and understand what's working and what's not working. And I think that built a huge credibility for this commission as it thought about how to address the most important issue in front of the city and the issue that New Yorkers just kept coming to our hearings and asking us to address. So I'm gratified that that has been recognized. I understand that this is going to change the role of the city council in certain land use decisions, not in everything, but in some. And that change is scary. and that they have an institutional prerogative to try to jealously guard. But I think what New Yorkers are most focused on is results and the affordability crisis. And so I think that these conversations about like who's going to have power and who's not going to have power are not front of mind for ordinary people. And so, we were focused not on whether people are good or bad, but whether the structure of the system we have is giving us good results. And um, and that's what we're spending our time explaining to people as they consider how they're going to vote.
And who appointed though the members of this commission that you were part of?
Oh, yes, the mayor appointed all the members of the commission. But as I pointed out, the commission is not exactly full of loyalists to Mayor Adams. It's really a cross section of New Yorkers who are an important part of civic life, who were part of the last 2 and 3 administrations in the city and understand how city government works.
Yeah.
And I'll say that these proposals have uh, gotten support by people like Governor Hochul and Controller Brad Lander and Borough President Antonio Reynoso and Borough President Donovan Richards. And if for the New Yorkers on who are listening to us, they'll understand these are not exactly the closest allies of Mayor Adams. And so I think that the support across the city kind of speaks to the credibility of our work and the independence of the commission.
Yeah, I mean, just a couple thoughts. Number one, Eric Adams doesn't really have a whole lot of close allies left anymore. The list of Eric Adams' close allies is a ever shortening list as his time in office draws to a close. So, like the idea that this is filled with Eric Adams lackeys is like there are no more Eric Adams lackeys for better or worse. Um, and I don't know. You were very polite and you were very respectful in your, well, change is scary and I understand their point. I tend to be a little bit more cynical about this. I tend to think that this is, look, local government on some level is a cartel. Like if you want to think about it real cynically, there are so few people get involved with local politics in most cities around the country that it really is like a very small group of people who can run things effectively. And if you look at most of the city council in New York, I would say 60 to 70% of them, like their previous job before being a council member was like being the chief of staff of the previous council member. It's a very it's a very incestuous group, and that you're probably thinking of a couple in your head right now. I can see you smiling a little bit. It's just I am more cynical about the ways in which they kind of hoard power, and I'm kind of glad to take some of the power out of their hands. At least in some circumstances, they're still going to have plenty of power after all this is said and done. They will still govern the most important city in the most important country in the world. Like, I'm not going to cry too many tears for them, but hopefully we will be able to build some more housing afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, I'll put it this way, which is New York's a democracy and it's going to stay a democracy. But the question is, how are we structuring the democratic process so that if there's a will of a majority of New Yorkers to see more housing, is the political system structured so that we'll actually get it? And that's fundamentally what these reforms are trying to do, to ensure that if there is a consensus that we need to add more housing, that democratic consensus can work it out through the system. And that's what's so lovely about a charter revision process. It's New Yorkers themselves that are going to decide whether these processes get created or not. They're going to vote yes or no on these questions, and that's what's going to decide it. So this is fundamentally democratic. It's happening at a citywide level. We're having a really robust citywide conversation about it, and I'll be excited to see where they land.
Hopefully we can build more housing. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have today, but I want to thank Alec one more time for coming on and letting us know what's going on with the charter revisions in New York City. This is kind of a deeply wonky topic, and I know it's very New York City specific, but I think it's pretty important whether or not the biggest city in America builds more housing. And hopefully things that happen in New York, if good things can happen here, maybe it echoes out into other places in the country. With that said, thank you one more time for listening, and we'll catch you at the next episode.